Something changed behind closed doors in Washington, and the message sent to Canada was impossible to ignore. After months of growing disagreements over trade, tariffs, and diplomatic tensions, senior U.S. officials signaled that the relationship between the two longtime allies may be entering one of its most uncertain periods in years. Negotiations that many expected to continue suddenly hit another obstacle, raising new questions about what happens next. Is this simply another chapter in a difficult trade dispute, or is it the beginning of a much larger shift in the relationship between the United States and Canada? The latest developments have sparked intense debate on both sides of the border, with businesses, political leaders, and ordinary citizens all wondering what the future holds. As new statements emerge from Washington and Ottawa, the stakes continue to rise, and every new announcement appears to add another layer of uncertainty. Here's what happened, why officials are taking a tougher tone, and what it could mean going forward. For decades, the United States and Canada have been viewed as two of the closest economic and political partners in the world. The two countries share one of the busiest borders on the planet, conduct hundreds of billions of dollars in trade every year, and rely heavily on each other's markets for everything from automobiles and energy to agriculture and manufacturing. Because of that long history, disagreements between Washington and Ottawa often attract attention well beyond North America. In recent months, however, the tone surrounding the relationship has become noticeably sharper. Officials from both governments have exchanged increasingly firm public statements over trade policy, tariffs, and broader economic priorities. While disagreements between allies are not unusual, observers have pointed out that the language used by senior officials has become more direct than many expected. One of the biggest issues remains trade. American officials have argued that certain Canadian policies create an uneven playing field for U.S. businesses and producers. Canadian leaders, meanwhile, have defended their approach, saying they are acting in Canada's national interest while responding to changing global economic conditions. As a result, negotiations have become more complicated, with each side emphasizing different priorities. Recent comments from Washington have drawn particular attention because they suggest growing frustration over the pace of discussions. Rather than presenting the dispute as a routine disagreement, several officials indicated that the United States expects meaningful progress before moving forward on certain issues. Those remarks immediately fueled speculation among analysts and news organizations about what future negotiations might look like. Political leaders in both countries also face domestic pressures. In the United States, policymakers are under pressure to demonstrate that American workers and industries are being protected in an increasingly competitive global economy. In Canada, leaders face expectations to defend Canadian businesses and maintain stable access to their country's largest export market. Those competing priorities can make compromise more difficult, even when both sides ultimately want to preserve a strong long-term partnership. Business groups have been watching these developments closely. Companies operating across the border depend on predictable trade rules, and prolonged uncertainty can make investment decisions more difficult. Manufacturers, exporters, farmers, and transportation companies all have an interest in seeing negotiations produce clear and stable outcomes. Even when disagreements remain limited to specific sectors, uncertainty alone can influence planning and market confidence. For many observers, the most important question is not whether the United States and Canada will continue working together, they almost certainly will, but rather how they will resolve the current disagreements. History shows that the two countries have overcome significant disputes before through negotiation and compromise. Whether the latest tensions follow a similar path remains to be seen. What is clear is that statements from senior officials have attracted widespread attention because they reflect the seriousness with which both governments view the issues currently on the table. As negotiations continue, every public comment, policy announcement, and diplomatic meeting is likely to be examined closely for clues about the direction of one of the world's most important bilateral relationships. And with so much depending on the outcome, the next round of developments could prove especially significant. As attention shifted from public statements to official actions, analysts began looking beyond the headlines to understand what the latest developments could mean. Diplomatic disagreements often unfold over weeks or months rather than days, and a single announcement rarely tells the full story. Instead, each statement becomes part of a larger negotiation in which both sides seek to strengthen their positions before returning to the table. Trade remains at the center of the discussion because of the deep economic ties between the two countries. Supply chains in North America are highly integrated, with goods crossing the border multiple times before reaching consumers. That means policy changes affecting one sector can have ripple effects across manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and retail. Businesses on both sides are therefore paying close attention to official announcements and any indication of future policy changes. Observers also note that public messaging serves multiple audiences. Government officials often communicate not only with foreign counterparts, but also with domestic industries, workers, and voters. As a result, statements delivered at press conferences or in interviews may be intended to demonstrate resolve while leaving room for continued negotiations behind closed doors. Former trade officials have pointed out that periods of heightened rhetoric do not necessarily signal a complete breakdown in relations. The United States and Canada have managed disagreements over tariffs, market access, and regulatory issues in the past, while continuing to cooperate on a wide range of economic and security matters. Even so, sustained uncertainty can make long-term planning more difficult for companies that depend on stable cross-border commerce. Economic analysts say that businesses generally prefer predictable rules and clear timelines. When negotiations become prolonged, companies may delay investments or reassess supply chains until there is greater clarity. For industries that rely on integrated North American production, certainty can be as important as the final agreement itself. Meanwhile, officials in both Washington and Ottawa continue to emphasize that discussions remain ongoing. While differences over specific policies have attracted significant public attention, both governments have also reiterated the importance of maintaining a productive relationship between two neighboring countries whose economies remain closely connected. With negotiations still evolving, attention is now focused on what future meetings, policy announcements, or joint statements might reveal. The next phase of discussions could help determine whether current tensions ease through compromise or whether additional trade disputes emerge in the months ahead. For businesses, policymakers, and citizens following these developments, the coming decisions may provide a clearer picture of where the relationship is headed. As discussions continue, another question has begun to draw attention. How much of the current tension is about immediate policy disagreements and how much reflects broader strategic priorities? Trade negotiations rarely take place in isolation. They often intersect with concerns about economic competitiveness, supply chain resilience, and long-term industrial policy. In recent years, both the United States and Canada have introduced measures intended to strengthen domestic industries while responding to changes in the global economy. Those efforts have sometimes aligned, but they have also produced areas of disagreement over subsidies, market access, and regulatory approaches. Such differences are common among major trading partners, although they can become more visible when negotiations are already under strain. Experts note that the public often sees only part of the negotiating process. Formal meetings, technical discussions, and consultations with industry groups frequently continue even when public rhetoric becomes more pointed. While headlines may emphasize conflict, officials behind the scenes often continue working toward practical solutions on specific issues. Business organizations in both countries have encouraged policymakers to maintain open channels of communication. Many companies operate across the border and depend on predictable trade rules. Manufacturers, agricultural producers, logistics providers, and retailers all have an interest in minimizing disruptions that could increase costs or delay shipments. Financial markets also monitor these developments closely. Although markets respond to many factors, uncertainty surrounding major trading relationships can influence business sentiment and investment decisions. For that reason, investors often watch official statements for indications that negotiations are progressing or becoming more difficult. Political analysts caution against drawing firm conclusions from individual announcements alone. Negotiations between governments typically involve multiple rounds of discussions, with positions evolving as new proposals are introduced. A statement that appears firm today may be followed by further talks aimed at finding common ground. At the same time, the current situation underscores the importance of the economic relationship between the United States and Canada. Despite disagreements over particular policies, the two countries remain deeply interconnected through trade, investment, and shared infrastructure. Decisions made in Washington and Ottawa can have significant effects on businesses and communities on both sides of the border. As observers await the next round of developments, the focus remains on whether negotiators can address outstanding concerns while preserving the broader partnership that has long been a cornerstone of North American economic cooperation. Until additional policy decisions are announced, many of the key questions remain open, making each official update an important piece of a larger and still evolving story. As negotiations move forward, attention is increasingly shifting from political rhetoric to practical outcomes. Businesses, investors, and consumers are looking for concrete policy decisions rather than public exchanges. While headlines often focus on dramatic statements, the long-term effects are typically determined by the agreements or disagreements that emerge through formal negotiations. Trade experts point out that economic relationships of this scale are rarely defined by a single event. Instead, they evolve through a series of decisions made over time. Regulatory changes, tariff policies, and market access rules all contribute to shaping how companies operate across borders. For industries with integrated supply chains, even relatively small policy adjustments can influence costs, production schedules, and future investment plans. Officials from both countries have continued to state publicly that communication remains active. Although disagreements persist on several issues, diplomatic and technical discussions are expected to continue. This reflects a broader reality of international relations. Countries with close economic ties often negotiate through periods of disagreement while maintaining cooperation in other areas. Several analysts have also emphasized that political transitions and changing economic conditions can alter negotiating priorities. Governments may adjust their positions in response to inflation, labor market conditions, global competition, or developments in international trade. As a result, today's negotiating stance may not necessarily reflect the final outcome. Industry groups continue to encourage stability and predictability. Manufacturers, exporters, agricultural producers, and transportation companies generally seek clear rules that allow them to plan for the future. Extended uncertainty can make investment decisions more challenging, particularly for businesses whose operations depend on cross-border commerce. The coming months are expected to include additional meetings, technical consultations, and public updates. Each announcement will likely be examined for signs of progress or remaining obstacles. While speculation is inevitable, observers caution that negotiations often proceed in stages, with breakthroughs sometimes occurring only after extended discussions. For now, the broader relationship between the United States and Canada remains one of the world's largest bilateral economic partnerships. Even during periods of tension, the two countries continue to share extensive commercial, security, and diplomatic ties. The central question is not whether that relationship will continue, but how current policy differences will shape its next chapter. Until further agreements are reached, businesses, policymakers, and the public will continue watching closely. Each new statement, meeting, or policy announcement may offer another indication of where negotiations are headed and whether the current period of uncertainty ultimately gives way to a renewed framework for cooperation or a longer phase of difficult bargaining. As this story continues to develop, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The outcome will depend less on public statements and more on the decisions made during ongoing negotiations. While headlines often highlight moments of tension, the real test will be whether officials can reach agreements that provide greater certainty for businesses, workers, and consumers in both countries. The economic relationship between the United States and Canada has been built over decades through extensive trade, investment, and cooperation. That foundation has weathered previous disagreements over tariffs, regulations, and market access. Although the current disputes have drawn significant public attention, history suggests that negotiations between close trading partners often involve periods of disagreement before compromises are reached. For businesses operating across the border, predictability remains a central concern. Companies planning future investments, managing supply chains, or negotiating long-term contracts generally benefit from clear and stable trade rules. Until additional policy decisions are announced, many organizations are likely to continue monitoring developments while preparing for a range of possible outcomes. The coming weeks and months are expected to bring further meetings between officials, additional policy announcements, and continued discussions on the issues currently under negotiation. Analysts will be watching closely for signs of progress, whether through formal agreements, joint statements, or incremental changes that indicate movement toward common ground. At the same time, developments in the global economy could also influence the direction of these talks. Changes in inflation, energy markets, manufacturing demand, or broader international trade conditions may affect the priorities of both governments. Negotiations rarely occur in isolation, and external factors often shape both the pace and substance of future decisions. For the public, it is important to distinguish between political messaging and official policy. Public remarks can signal priorities or negotiating positions, but lasting changes generally result from formal agreements, legislation, or regulatory action. As additional information becomes available, a clearer picture of the long-term impact will emerge. Until then, the relationship between the United States and Canada remains one of considerable importance to North America's economy. Both countries continue to share deep commercial ties, extensive cross-border trade, and long-standing diplomatic cooperation. How current disagreements are resolved will help determine the next phase of that partnership. For now, the story is still unfolding. Each official announcement, negotiation session, and policy decision adds another piece to a complex picture that continues to evolve. As more information becomes available, observers on both sides of the border will be watching closely to see whether these negotiations lead to renewed cooperation, further policy adjustments, or a new chapter in one of the world's most significant trading relationships.